The dust kicked up in angry swirls as the three men on horseback came to a stop outside the weathered cabin, their badges catching the harsh Texas sunlight, and inside, Penelope Edwards felt her baby kick hard against her swollen belly, as if warning her that trouble had finally found them both. She stood behind the thin curtain, one hand pressed against the rough wooden wall to steady herself, the other cradling the roundness that held her future. 7 months along now, and the weight of it pulled at her back, something fierce in the September heat of 1881. Through the gap in the fabric, she could see Sheriff Coleman and 2 of his deputies, all 3 looking grim and determined as they dismounted with deliberate slowness. Her husband Thomas had been dead 3 weeks now. 3 weeks since they found him face down in the creek with a bullet in his back. 3 weeks since Sheriff Coleman had looked her in the eye and told her Thomas had been caught stealing cattle from the Morrison Ranch. 3 weeks since her entire world had collapsed into ash and bitter accusations. But Penelope knew the truth. Thomas had been many things, stubborn and proud chief among them, but he was no thief. The Morrisons wanted their land, this little parcel with its good water access and fertile soil, and they had found the cheapest way to take it. A bullet, a lie, and the law on their side. The knock came hard and authoritative. "Mrs. Edwards, open up. We need to talk about your situation here." Penelope smoothed down her worn calico dress and walked to the door, lifting the latch with trembling fingers. The afternoon heat rushed in along with the 3 men, their shadows falling long across her threshold. "Sheriff Coleman," she said, keeping her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs, "I have nothing more to say to you." The sheriff was a thick man with a gray mustache that drooped past his jaw. His eyes held no warmth as they swept over her condition with something like distaste. "That may be, but I've got plenty to say to you. The territorial judge has ruled on your husband's debts. The cattle he stole were worth considerable money, and that debt transfers to his estate." "He stole nothing," Penelope said sharply, "and you know it." "What I know is what the evidence showed," Coleman replied, his voice flat. "And what the judge ruled. You got 3 days to settle accounts or this property goes to auction. The Morrisons have first right of purchase as the injured party." The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Penelope had to bite back a gasp. "I have no money. You took what little we had for the burial." "Then I suggest you find some charity among your neighbors," the sheriff said, "or make other arrangements. Either way, come Thursday morning, you vacate these premises." One of the deputies, a young man with pockmarked cheeks, shifted uncomfortably. "Sheriff, she's in a family way. Where's she supposed to go?" "That ain't my concern, Miller," Coleman snapped. "Law's the law. She's got 3 days." Penelope felt the walls closing in, felt the future narrowing to a pinpoint of desperation. "Please, just give me until after the baby comes. Another 2 months, that's all I ask." 3 days, Mrs. Edwards." The sheriff turned to leave, then paused at the threshold. "And don't get any ideas about running. I got men watching the roads. You try to leave Del Rio, you'll be brought back to face charges for evading legal obligations." They left as they had come, in a cloud of dust and menace, and Penelope stood in the doorway watching them go until they were nothing but dark specks against the brown horizon. Then she closed the door, slid down against it, and let the tears come hot and angry. She did not know how long she sat there, her hands wrapped around her belly, whispering promises to the child inside that she had no idea how to keep. The sun moved lower, painting the cabin walls gold and then amber, and still she sat frozen in her despair. The sound of hoofbeats brought her head up sharply. More men. Perhaps the sheriff had returned to make things even worse, to demand she leave today instead of in 3 days. She hauled herself to her feet, wincing at the ache in her lower back, and peered through the curtain again. One rider this time, sitting easy in the saddle on a big bay gelding. He wore a dusty black hat pulled low, dark trousers, and a blue shirt faded nearly white from sun and washing. Twin revolvers rode his hips, and a bedroll was tied behind his saddle, along with bulging saddlebags. As he drew closer, she could see he was young, maybe 25 or 26, with dark hair and several days' worth of stubble shadowing a strong jaw. He stopped his horse 20 feet from the cabin and called out, "Mrs. Edwards, I hope I'm not intruding. Name's Gideon Xander. I worked with your husband on the cattle drive last spring." Penelope pushed open the door cautiously. "I remember Thomas mentioning you. You were the one who pulled him out of the stampede." Gideon nodded, swinging down from his horse with fluid grace. "Yes, madam, I heard about what happened to him. I was up in Kansas when word reached me, and I came soon as I could. I'm real sorry for your loss. Thomas was a good man." Something in the sincerity of his voice made Penelope's throat tighten. "Thank you? That means more than you know, to hear someone say that. The sheriff and half this town have been calling him a thief." "Thomas Edwards was no thief," Gideon said firmly. He removed his hat, revealing sweat-dark hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. "I worked alongside him for 3 months straight. He was as honest as they come. Whatever happened, there's more to the story." "The Morrisons wanted our land," Penelope said, the words tumbling out now that she had someone who might actually listen. "They made several offers, each one lower than the last, trying to force us into selling. Thomas refused every time. Then 2 months ago, Morrison's foreman warned Thomas that bad things happen to folks who don't know when to quit. And now Thomas is dead, branded a thief, and the sheriff just informed me I have 3 days before they auction this place right out from under me." Gideon's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "Were you here when they found the cattle on your land?" "There were no cattle on our land," Penelope said. "Sheriff Coleman claimed they found 3 Morrison steers in our north pasture, but I was here all day that day, and I never saw any such thing. By the time I heard about it, Thomas was already dead, and the supposed evidence was gone, driven back to Morrison's ranch." "Convenient," Gideon muttered. He glanced back toward town, then at the lowering sun. "Mrs. Edwards, would you mind if I made camp nearby tonight? I don't like the feel of this situation, and I'd rest easier knowing you weren't out here alone." Penelope hesitated. She did not know this man, not really, beyond Thomas's brief mentions and the gratitude her husband had expressed for a life saved. But there was something solid and reassuring in Gideon's steady gaze, something that made her want to trust him. "The well water is clean," she said finally, "and there's grazing in the back pasture. You're welcome to camp there." "Thank you, madam." Gideon put his hat back on and gathered his horse's reins. "I'll be close if you need anything." He led his horse around the side of the cabin, and Penelope went back inside, feeling somehow less alone than she had moments before. She busied herself with supper, such as it was, a thin stew made from the last of the salt pork and some withered vegetables from the garden. Her appetite had fled, but she forced herself to eat for the baby's sake, spooning the bland mixture into her mouth while her mind raced with impossible problems. 3 days. How could she possibly find the money the judge demanded in 3 days? She had already sold everything of value to pay for Thomas's burial. Her wedding ring sat in a pawn shop in town, along with her mother's silver brush and the pocket watch that had belonged to Thomas's father. She had nothing left but the clothes on her back and the furniture in this cabin, and none of it would fetch enough to satisfy the debt Coleman claimed she owed. A knock on the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. She opened it to find Gideon standing there with his hat in his hands, looking almost bashful. "I'm sorry to bother you again, madam, but I happened to catch some rabbits while I was setting up camp, and I thought you could use some fresh meat. I know times are hard." He held out 2 cleaned rabbits, their pale flesh gleaming in the dying light. Penelope felt tears prick her eyes at the simple kindness. "Thank you," she managed. "That's very thoughtful." "It's nothing," Gideon said. "I'll bid you good night now. You need anything at all, you just holler. I'm a light sleeper." He left before she could respond, melting back into the gathering dusk like a shadow. Penelope looked down at the rabbits in her hands and felt something shift in her chest, some small ember of hope flickering to life in the darkness. That night, she dreamed of Thomas. He stood in a field of wildflowers, the sun behind him turning his hair to gold, and he smiled at her the way he used to before the worry and fear had etched lines into his face. "It's all right, Penny," he said, using the nickname only he had ever called her. "You're going to be all right. Trust him." She woke before dawn, the dream still vivid in her mind, and lay listening to the sounds of the waking world outside. A rooster crowed somewhere in the distance. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods along the creek. And from the direction of the back pasture, she heard Gideon's voice, low and soothing, talking to his horse. Penelope rose and dressed, splashing water on her face from the basin and pinning up her dark blonde hair. She looked at herself in the small mirror on the wall and barely recognized the woman staring back. When had she become so pale and drawn, her eyes so shadowed with exhaustion and grief? She was frying bacon when she heard the riders coming fast and hard, The sound made her stomach clench with dread. She moved to the window and felt her blood turn cold. Sheriff Coleman again, but this time he had brought 5 men instead of 2. They spread out in a loose semicircle around the front of the cabin, cutting off any avenue of escape. The sheriff sat his horse with the satisfied expression of a man who held all the cards. "Mrs. Edwards," he called out, "we need to have another conversation. Come on out." Penelope's hands shook as she untied her apron. This was wrong. They were not supposed to return for 3 days. What had changed? She opened the door and stepped out into the early morning light, one hand automatically going to support her belly. "Sheriff, you said I had 3 days." "Plans changed," Coleman said flatly. "The Morrison family has agreed to forgive the debt entirely if you sign over the deed to this property right now. It's a generous offer, Mrs. Edwards, more than generous considering the circumstances. You should take it. And if I refuse, then we arrest you for conspiracy in your husband's theft, and you can have your baby in a jail cell." Coleman's smile was cold as a snake's. "Either way, you're leaving this land, but only one of those ways lets you walk away free." "You cannot arrest me," Penelope said, though fear made her voice shake. "I had nothing to do with any of this. I have committed no crime." "That's for a judge to decide," Coleman replied. "And seeing as how the nearest circuit judge won't be through here for another 6 weeks, you'd have plenty of time to think about your choices while you wait for trial." One of the deputies, not the young pockmarked one from yesterday, but an older man with cruel eyes, nudged his horse forward. "Just sign the paper, woman. Make it easy on yourself." "She is not signing anything." The voice came from behind the cabin, and Penelope turned to see Gideon striding around the corner, his hands resting casually on his gun belts. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who had faced down trouble before and come out the other side. Sheriff Coleman's expression darkened. "Who the hell are you?" "Name's Gideon Xander. I'm a friend of the family." He came to stand beside Penelope, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the clean scent of soap and leather. "And I'm telling you right now, she's under my protection. You want to bully a pregnant widow, you're going to have to go through me first." The tension ratcheted up instantly, thick enough to choke on. The deputies shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward their weapons. Coleman held up a hand to stop them, his eyes never leaving Gideon. "You're making a mistake, friend," the sheriff said softly. "This is legal business. You interfere, I'll have you in irons alongside her." "This is not legal business. This is extortion," Gideon said, his voice calm but hard as iron. "You're using your badge to steal from a woman who has lost everything. That is not law. That is just plain theft with a veneer of authority." "You calling me a thief?" Coleman's face flushed dark red. "I'm saying you need to ride away from here and give Mrs. Edwards the 3 days you promised her." Gideon's stance shifted slightly, and Penelope recognized the coiled readiness of a man prepared to draw if necessary. "And if you don't, there are going to be questions asked. Questions about how Thomas Edwards really died. Questions about why you were so quick to declare him guilty without a proper investigation. Questions about your relationship with the Morrison family and how much they're paying you to clear this land for them." The silence stretched taut as a wire. Penelope held her breath, waiting for the explosion she felt certain was coming. But Coleman was no fool. His gaze flicked over Gideon, taking in the worn handles of those twin revolvers, the loose way he stood, the absolute lack of fear in his eyes. Whatever the sheriff saw there made him recalculate. 3 days, Coleman said finally. "But that's all she gets. Come Thursday morning, I'll be back with a federal marshal. And if she is not gone by then, I will arrest her. And if you're still here playing protector, I'll arrest you too." He wheeled his horse around. "Let's go, boys." They rode off in a thunder of hoofbeats, leaving Penelope and Gideon standing in the dusty yard. As soon as they were out of sight, Penelope's knees went weak and she swayed. Gideon caught her elbow, steadying her. "Easy now," he said gently. "Come on, let's get you sitting down." He guided her to the bench outside the cabin door, and she sank onto it gratefully, her heart still hammering. "You should not have done that. You put yourself in danger for a stranger." "You're not a stranger," Gideon said, crouching down so he was at eye level with her. "You're the wife of a man who saved my life, and that makes you family as far as I'm concerned. Besides, I cannot stand by and watch injustice happen when I have the power to stop it." Penelope looked into his gray eyes and saw nothing but sincerity there. Why are you really here, Mr. Xander? You said you came as soon as you heard about Thomas, but that does not explain why you would stay. Why you would stand up to the sheriff for me." Gideon was quiet for a moment, then sat back on his heels. "I came because I owed Thomas a debt, and I intended to pay my respects and make sure his widow was all right. I'm staying because I can see plain as day that something wrong happened here, and because you need help, whether you want to admit it or not." "I cannot pay you," Penelope said quietly. "Did I ask for payment?" Gideon stood and resettled his hat. "Now, how about you go finish making that breakfast before it burns, and then we're going to sit down and figure out exactly what happened to your husband." The morning sun climbed higher as they sat at Penelope's small kitchen table, the bacon and eggs she had cooked growing cold as she told Gideon everything she knew. It was not much, just fragments and feelings and the terrible certainty that Thomas had been murdered for standing in the way of a powerful man's greed. "Morrison is one of the biggest ranchers in this part of Texas," Penelope explained, her hands wrapped around a cup of weak coffee. "He came to Del Rio 5 years ago from somewhere back east with money and ambition. Bought up half the valley, and what he could not buy, he took through other means. There have been 3 suspicious fires in the past 2 years, all on properties Morrison wanted. 2 men have disappeared entirely, and now Thomas is dead." "And the sheriff is in Morrison's pocket," Gideon said. "I believe so, or at the very least, he is too afraid of Morrison to do his job properly." Penelope set down her cup. "But belief is not proof, and without proof, there is nothing anyone can do. Morrison has lawyers and money and influence. I have nothing." "You have me," Gideon said simply. "And sometimes one determined person is all it takes to bring down a corrupt system." Penelope wanted to believe him, but the weight of her situation pressed down on her like a physical thing. "Even if we could somehow prove Morrison was behind Thomas's death, what good would it do? The sheriff won't arrest him. The judge rules in favor of whoever pays him the most. And I still have to leave here in 3 days or go to jail. Then we have 3 days to find evidence and figure out a way to keep you safe," Gideon said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The touch sent a shock of warmth up her arm. "I know you don't know me well enough to trust me yet, Mrs. Edwards, but I'm asking you to try. Let me help you." Penelope looked down at his hand covering hers, rough and calloused from years of hard work, and felt something shift inside her. It had been so long since anyone had offered her comfort or help without expecting something in return. So long since she had felt anything but alone. "All right," she said softly. "And please, call me Penelope. Mrs. Edwards makes me feel like an old woman." A smile flickered across Gideon's face, transforming his serious features into something warmer and more open. "Penelope, that's a pretty name. My mother loved Greek mythology," she said, feeling her cheeks warm. "She named me after the faithful wife who waited 20 years for her husband to return." "A good omen, then," Gideon said. Penelope was clever as well as faithful. She outsmarted all those suitors with her weaving trick. Penelope blinked in surprise. "You know the story?" "My mother was a schoolteacher," Gideon said, a note of fondness in his voice. "She made sure I could read and write and knew the classics. Said a man's education was the one thing nobody could steal from him." His expression clouded. "She died of fever when I was 15. After that, I left home and made my own way." "I'm sorry," Penelope said, meaning it. "My parents died within a year of each other when I was 17. That is how I ended up in Texas. I had nothing left in Missouri, so I came west looking for a fresh start. Met Thomas at a church social in Del Rio, and we were married 6 months later." "How long were you married?" Gideon asked gently. 4 years. Penelope's hand went to her belly. "We had been trying for a baby almost from the beginning. I had 2 miscarriages before this one took. Thomas was so happy when the doctor confirmed I was pregnant. He talked about his son every day, made plans for teaching him to ride and rope and all the things fathers dream about." Her voice wavered. "He never got to know if it was a boy or girl. He died before we could find out. He knew he was going to be a father," Gideon said. "That's what mattered to him. And wherever he is now, I think he'd want you to fight for this baby, to make sure his child has the life he wanted to give." Penelope nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Gideon squeezed her hand once more, then stood. "I'm going to ride into Del Rio and ask some questions," he said, quietly so as not to stir up trouble. There has to be someone in that town who knows something, someone who saw what really happened the day Thomas died. Be careful, Penelope said. The sheriff will be watching for you now. I'm always careful. Gideon collected his hat and headed for the door. Keep the door barred while I'm gone. Don't open it for anyone except me. After he left, Penelope did as he instructed, dropping the heavy wooden bar across the door and checking that all the windows were latched. The cabin felt smaller somehow with Gideon gone, the walls pressing in on her again. She tried to keep busy, washing the breakfast dishes and sweeping the floor, but her mind kept circling back to the impossible situation she found herself in. 3 days. The clock was ticking down toward an outcome she could not accept but seemed powerless to prevent. And yet, for the first time since Thomas died, she felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. Gideon Xander had walked into her life like an answer to a prayer she had not even known how to voice. He was capable and steady and unafraid of the forces arrayed against her. More than that, there was a kindness in him that touched something deep in her battered heart. The baby kicked, and Penelope rested both hands on her belly, feeling the firm pressure of a tiny foot or elbow moving beneath her skin. Your papa would have liked him, she whispered. I think they would have been friends. The hours dragged by with agonizing slowness. Penelope tried to rest but could not settle, her ears straining for the sound of returning hoofbeats. When they finally came in the late afternoon, she rushed to the window and felt relief flood through her at the sight of Gideon's bay gelding. She lifted the bar and opened the door as he dismounted. One look at his face told her he had found something. What is it? She asked. What did you learn? Gideon waited until they were inside with the door closed before he spoke. I talked to the undertaker. Nice fellow named Carlson, seemed like the honest type. He said when they brought Thomas's body in, the bullet wound was in his back, angled downward like someone shot him from horseback. But here's the interesting part. There was bruising on Thomas's face and knuckles that suggested he had been in a fight shortly before he died. A fight? Penelope frowned. With who? Carlson didn't know, but he said it looked recent, maybe an hour or two before death. He mentioned it to Sheriff Coleman, but Coleman told him it wasn't important, that Thomas had probably gotten into a scuffle in town earlier that day. Gideon leaned against the kitchen table, his arms crossed. But I checked with folks around town, and nobody saw Thomas in Del Rio that day. In fact, several people remember seeing him working on your north fence line in the morning. Penelope's mind raced, putting pieces together. So, he was not in town. He was here, on our land, and someone came here and fought with him before shooting him in the back. That's what it looks like to me. Gideon's expression was grim. I also talked to the clerk at the general store. He said about a week before Thomas died, there was an altercation between Thomas and Kurt Morrison, the rancher's eldest son. Kurt had been drinking and started mouthing off about how the Edwards place would look good as part of the Morrison spread. Thomas told him he'd see hell freeze over first. Kurt apparently did not take kindly to that and threw a punch. Thomas laid him out cold with one hit. I remember that, Penelope said. Thomas came home with bruised knuckles and told me he'd had to teach a young fool some manners. I did not realize it was Kurt Morrison. Kurt's about 22, 23, Gideon said. Got a reputation as a hothead. The store clerk said Kurt swore he'd make Thomas pay for embarrassing him. He paused. The day Thomas died, Kurt Morrison was seen riding out toward this direction in the early afternoon. He came back a few hours later with his rifle and both his revolvers, even though he'd left with just one revolver that morning. The implications hung heavy in the air between them. Penelope sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. Kurt killed him. Kurt Morrison murdered my husband over a punch in a barroom argument. That's my thinking, Gideon said, but proving it is another matter entirely. Kurt would just deny it, and his father would back him up. Without a witness or physical evidence tying Kurt to the scene, it's your word against the Morrisons, and we both know how that would play out. Then what do we do? Penelope asked desperately. How do we stop them from taking everything? Gideon was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant as he worked through the problem. Finally, he said, We need to get you away from Del Rio, somewhere the Morrisons and Coleman can't reach you. And then we need to find someone with the authority and integrity to investigate this properly. I cannot just leave, Penelope protested. This is my home, and you heard Coleman. He said he has men watching the roads. We won't take the roads, Gideon said. I know this country, Penelope. There are trails through the hills that nobody uses anymore, old Apache paths and smuggler routes. We can slip out before dawn, be miles away before Coleman even knows you're gone. But where would we go? I have no family, no money, nowhere to take refuge. I have a friend in San Antonio, Gideon said. Name's Carlos Mendoza. He's a ranger, one of the good ones, honest as the day is long. If we can get to him and tell him what's been happening here, he'll have the authority to come back and investigate. And the Morrisons won't be able to intimidate a Texas Ranger the way they can a local sheriff. It was a plan, at least. Not a perfect one, but better than waiting here for Thursday to arrive and bring with it either eviction or arrest. Penelope looked around the cabin, at the home she and Thomas had built together, and felt her heart break a little more. Leaving meant giving up, meant letting the Morrisons win. But staying meant losing everything anyway, and possibly her freedom, or even her life. And she had more than herself to think about now. Her hand went to her belly, feeling the life growing there. She had to protect her child, no matter what it cost her. All right, she said quietly. We'll go to San Antonio. Gideon's face showed relief and something else, something warmer that made Penelope's pulse quicken. Good. We'll leave before first light. Pack only what you absolutely need, things you can fit in a small bag. Dress warmly, the nights are getting cold. They spent the rest of the evening preparing. Penelope gathered her few remaining possessions, a change of clothes, Thomas's pocket knife that she had kept back from the pawn shop, the Bible that had been her mother's, and a small daguerreotype of her and Thomas on their wedding day. It all fit into a worn carpet bag that felt painfully light. Gideon saw to the horses, checking his gelding's shoes and hooves, organizing his supplies. He came in at dusk, looking troubled. "What is it?" Penelope asked. "Two riders on the ridge to the north," he said. "They've been sitting there for the past hour watching the cabin. Coleman's men, most likely, making sure you don't try to run. Then how will we get past them?" A slow smile curved Gideon's mouth. "We'll give them something to watch. I'll light a fire in the hearth and leave a lamp burning in the window. From a distance, it'll look like someone's still here. Meanwhile, we'll slip out the back on foot, through the creek bed. It'll be cold and wet, but the water will hide our tracks. We'll circle around to where I have my horse, and then we'll ride south instead of east. By the time they realize we're gone, we'll have enough of a head start that catching us will be near impossible." "You have done this before," Penelope said. It was not a question. "Once or twice," Gideon admitted. "I haven't always been on the right side of the law myself. When I was younger and angrier, I made some choices I'm not proud of. But I served my time for those mistakes, and I've spent the years since trying to be better than I was." Penelope studied his face in the lamplight, seeing the shadows there, the weight of a past he carried. "We all have things we regret," she said softly. "What matters is who we choose to be now." "That's a generous way of looking at it," Gideon said. "Most folks just see what they want to see and judge accordingly." "I see a man who has shown me more kindness in 2 days than most of this town has shown in 2 years," Penelope replied. "That is all I need to know about you." The look Gideon gave her was full of an emotion she could not quite name, something raw and grateful and almost wondering. "You're easy to want to help," he said quietly. "You're strong in a way that has nothing to do with muscle or guns. You've been beaten down and you're still standing. That takes courage most people don't have." Penelope felt her cheeks warm under his praise. "I'm standing because I have no other choice. If I had the luxury of falling apart, believe me, I would have done so by now." "I don't believe that for a second," Gideon said. "You're a fighter, Penelope Edwards. Your husband knew that. That's probably one of the reasons he loved you." They ate a cold supper of bread and cheese, neither wanting to risk the smell of cooking attracting attention. As full dark settled over the land, Gideon built up the fire and arranged things in the cabin to look as if the occupants had simply gone to bed. Penelope changed into her most practical dress, a dark brown wool that would not show dirt, and pulled on her sturdy boots. "Ready?" Gideon asked. No, Penelope thought. She would never be ready to leave the home where she had been happy, where she had loved and been loved in return. But she nodded anyway, picked up her carpetbag, and followed Gideon to the back door. The night air hit her like a cold slap. September in Texas could swing between hot days and frigid nights, and this was shaping up to be one of the cold ones. Stars glittered overhead in a vast sweep of silver, beautiful and indifferent. Gideon moved ahead of her, with the sure-footed confidence of a man comfortable in darkness, and Penelope followed as best she could, one hand pressed to the small of her aching back. The creek was even colder than the air, the water shockingly icy as it soaked through her boots and the hem of her dress. Penelope gasped but did not cry out, biting her lip against the discomfort. Gideon was beside her in an instant, his hand under her elbow, steadying her. "I've got you," he murmured, "just a little farther." They waded downstream for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, the rocky creek bed treacherous in the darkness. Twice Penelope stumbled, and both times Gideon caught her before she could fall. The cold made her teeth chatter, and the weight of the baby seemed to pull her forward, threatening her balance. Finally, Gideon guided her up the creek bank and into a dense stand of mesquite. "Wait here," he whispered, and disappeared into the night like smoke. Penelope crouched in the shadows, shivering and miserable, every nerve screaming with tension. What if something happened to Gideon? What if Coleman's men had found his horse? What if they were walking into a trap? But then she heard the soft shuffle of hooves, and Gideon materialized out of the darkness leading his bay gelding. The horse snorted softly, its breath steaming in the cold air. "Up you go," Gideon said, and before Penelope could protest, he had lifted her into the saddle with surprising gentleness. He swung up behind her, his arms coming around her on either side as he gathered the reins. "Lean back against me. You'll be warmer that way." Penelope did not have the strength to argue. She let herself relax into the solid warmth of his chest, felt his heartbeat steady and strong against her back. Gideon clucked softly to the horse, and they moved off through the darkness at a careful walk, picking their way between trees and rocks. They rode in silence for hours, Gideon navigating by starlight and some innate sense of direction Penelope could not fathom. She drifted in and out of an exhausted doze, her body too weary to maintain alertness despite her fear. Each time she jolted awake, Gideon's arms tightened fractionally around her, a wordless reassurance that she was safe. Dawn found them high in the hills above Del Rio, the town a distant collection of buildings touched gold by the rising sun. Gideon reined in at a spot that gave them a clear view of the land behind them. Nothing moved on the trails below. No dust clouds marked pursuing riders. "We made it," Penelope said, hardly daring to believe it. "First part anyway," Gideon replied. "We've got a long road ahead still. San Antonio is a good 4 days' ride from here, maybe 5, given that we'll need to take it easier than I normally would." His meaning was clear, easier for her condition. "I will keep up," Penelope said, stung. "I won't slow you down." "I know you won't," Gideon said. "You're tougher than boot leather, but being tough doesn't mean being foolish. You're 7 months pregnant and you've had almost no sleep. We'll rest during the heat of the day and travel morning and evening. It'll take longer, but it's safer for both of you." The casual way he included the baby in his considerations made something warm bloom in Penelope's chest. Thomas had been excited about the baby, but he had also been abstract about it, as if fatherhood was a concept rather than a reality. Gideon spoke of her child as a present person, someone who mattered. They found a sheltered spot under an overhang of rock where a spring trickled down into a clear pool. Gideon helped Penelope down from the horse and spread out his bedroll for her. "Sleep," he said. "I'll keep watch." "You need rest too," Penelope protested. "I'll sleep later. Right now, you're dead on your feet, and that's not good for you or the baby." He gave her a gentle push toward the bedroll. "Go on. I promise I'll wake you if anything happens." Penelope was too exhausted to argue further. She lay down on the bedroll, which still held the warmth and scent of Gideon's body, and was asleep before she could even form another thought. She woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. The sun was high overhead, painting the rocks in shades of red and gold. Gideon crouched by a small fire, tending a pan and a battered coffee pot. He looked over as she stirred and smiled. "Good, you're up. I was starting to worry you'd sleep through to tomorrow. How do you feel?" "Sore," Penelope admitted, sitting up slowly. "And I need a moment of privacy." "Of course," Gideon pointed. "There's a good spot just around that boulder. I won't look." When Penelope returned, feeling marginally more human, Gideon had a plate ready for her. Bacon, hardtack softened in bacon grease, and a tin cup of coffee. It was the best meal she had tasted in weeks. "You're a good cook," she said between bites. "Trail cooking isn't exactly high art," Gideon said with a laugh. but I learned young that a man who can feed himself well has a better chance of surviving. I've eaten enough burned beans and raw flour paste to know the value of doing it right. They ate in comfortable silence, the tension of the night before easing in the warmth of the day. When they finished, Gideon cleaned the dishes with sand and a little water from the spring, while Penelope stretched her cramped muscles. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a while. "Anything. Why did you really come to Del Rio? Not the surface reason about paying respects, but the real reason." Gideon was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the vast expanse of Texas spreading below them. "Thomas saved my life during that cattle drive," he said finally. "I don't just mean from the stampede, though that would have been enough. I mean, he saved me from myself. I was in a dark place when I signed on for that drive. I had just gotten out of prison after serving 2 years for armed robbery. I was angry at the world, convinced that nothing I did mattered, that I was just going to end up dead in a ditch somewhere, and nobody would care." He paused, and Penelope waited, sensing there was more. Thomas saw through all that anger to what was underneath. He talked to me during the long watches, told me about his life, about you, about his hopes for the future. He made me realize that just because I had made mistakes didn't mean I was defined by them. He said every day was a chance to choose better, to be better. Gideon's voice roughened. "He gave me hope, Penelope. He gave me a reason to try again. So when I heard he was dead, and that people were calling him a thief, I could not just let that stand. I owed him. And more than that, I wanted to make sure his family was taken care of, the way he would have taken care of mine if our positions had been reversed." Penelope felt tears prick her eyes. "He never told me about any of that, about your past or what you talked about." "Thomas wasn't the type to break a confidence," Gideon said. "He knew I had shared things with him I didn't share with most people. He respected that." He turned to look at her, his gray eyes serious. "I'm telling you now because I want you to understand why I'm doing this. It's not just about justice or fighting corruption or protecting a pregnant widow, though those are all part of it. It's about honoring a debt to a man who saw worth in me when I could not see it in myself." "Thank you," Penelope said softly, "for telling me, for being here, for everything." "You don't have to thank me," Gideon said. "Just let me help you. That's all the thanks I need." They rested through the afternoon heat, then set out again as the sun lowered toward the western horizon. Riding was easier this time, Penelope more accustomed to the rhythm of the horse and the feel of Gideon's arms around her. They talked as they rode, sharing stories of their childhoods, their families, the paths that had led them to this moment. Penelope learned that Gideon had been raised in Kentucky, that his father had been a blacksmith who drank too much, and his mother a gentlewoman who had loved books and learning. She learned that Gideon had left home at 15 after his mother died, unable to bear living with his father's grief-fueled rages. He had worked a dozen different jobs as he drifted west: farmhand, miner, ranch hand, occasionally things less legal when desperation drove him to it. The robbery that had landed him in prison had been born of hunger and stupidity in equal measure. He and 2 other drifters had held up a stagecoach, gotten away with a small strongbox, and been caught 3 days later when one of his companions got drunk and bragged about the take. Gideon had been 19 years old and convinced his life was over. "Prison was hell," he said quietly, "but it also gave me time to think, to figure out who I wanted to be. When I got out, I swore I'd stay on the right side of the law from then on. It hasn't always been easy, and I've been tempted more than once to slip back into old ways, but I made a promise to myself, and I've kept it." "That takes strength," Penelope said. "It would be easier to blame circumstances, to say you had no choice." "There's always a choice," Gideon replied. "Sometimes all the options are bad, but we still get to choose which bad option we take. That's what makes us human, instead of just animals reacting to the world around us." Penelope told him about her own life, about growing up in Missouri as the only child of older parents who had thought they could not have children. She had been loved fiercely and taught to value education and integrity above all else. Her father had been a clerk, her mother a seamstress, and they had given her a childhood full of books and music and laughter. When they died, first her father of a sudden heart failure, and then her mother of what the doctor had called a broken heart, but was probably just exhaustion and pneumonia, Penelope had been left with nothing. Her father's employer had taken their house in payment for debts she had not known existed, and the few neighbors who might have helped her had problems of their own, so she had sold everything she could, bought a train ticket west, and arrived in Del Rio with $12 in her pocket and a determination to build a new life. She had found work as a seamstress and a laundress, saved every penny, and when Thomas Edwards had started courting her with his shy smiles and earnest declarations, she had let herself fall in love with the idea of permanence, of belonging somewhere again. Was it a happy marriage? Gideon asked carefully, as if afraid the question might hurt. It was a good marriage, Penelope said, choosing her words with care. Thomas was a good man, kind and hard-working. He never raised his voice to me, never raised his hand. He provided for me as best he could, and he was faithful. I loved him. She paused. But I think if I'm being honest, I loved the life we were building more than I loved the man himself. Does that make me a terrible person? It makes you human, Gideon said. Real love isn't always like the stories in books. Sometimes it's about partnership and respect and shared goals as much as it is about passion. Did you love him? The question slipped out before Penelope could stop it, and she felt her face heat. I'm sorry, that was inappropriate. No, it's all right, Gideon said. I cared about Thomas deeply. He was a good friend to me when I needed one. But love? He was quiet for a moment. I don't know that I've ever really been in love with anyone. I've wanted women, sure, and there have been a few I cared for. But the kind of love people write poems about, the kind that makes you feel like you'd burn the world down, or build it up depending on what she needed. I've never felt that. Maybe you will someday, Penelope said softly. Maybe, Gideon agreed. Or maybe I'm not built for that kind of feeling. Some people aren't. They made camp that night in a sheltered canyon, the walls rising high on either side, and a thin stream providing fresh water. Gideon set up his bedroll for Penelope again, and made his own bed on the hard ground nearby, close enough that she could reach him if she needed to, but far enough to be proper. As Penelope lay watching the stars wheel overhead, she found herself thinking about Gideon's words, about love and what it meant. She had loved Thomas, she truly had. But it had been a comfortable, quiet love, built on shared faith and common goals. There had been affection and partnership, but not the kind of fire she had read about in the few romantic novels she had managed to get her hands on. Lying here in the darkness with Gideon nearby, she found herself wondering what that kind of love would feel like, the kind that consumed you, that made everything else seem pale and unimportant by comparison. The baby kicked hard, as if reminding her that she had more pressing concerns than romantic fantasies. Penelope rested her hand on her belly and whispered a prayer for safe travels and a better future. And if her prayer included a quiet thank you for Gideon Xander and his steadfast presence, well, that was between her and God. The next 3 days fell into a pattern. They would rise before dawn, ride for several hours while the air was still cool, then rest during the heat of midday before setting out again in the evening. It was slow going, and Penelope could see the frustration in the tense line of Gideon's shoulders each time they had to stop for her to rest or attend to her needs. But he never complained, never made her feel like she was a burden. He helped her on and off the horse with patient gentleness, made sure she ate enough and drank plenty of water, even fashioned a cushion out of his spare shirt to make the saddle more comfortable for her. They saw no signs of pursuit, though Gideon remained vigilant, always scanning the horizon, always listening for the sound of riders. At night, he would sit with his back to a rock and his rifle across his knees, dozing lightly while Penelope slept more deeply. She began to notice small things about him. The way he hummed old songs under his breath while he worked. The careful way he handled his weapons, checking and cleaning them each night with the attention of a man who knew his life might depend on their reliability. The kindness in his eyes when he looked at her, a warmth that made her feel seen and valued in a way she had not experienced in a long time, and she began to notice the way her own heart would speed up when he smiled at her, the way her skin tingled when his hand brushed hers, the way she found herself watching him when she thought he was not looking. It was wrong, she told herself. Thomas had been dead less than a month. She was 7 months pregnant with his child. She had no business feeling attracted to another man, especially one she barely knew. But the heart did not care about should or should not. And Penelope found herself thinking about Gideon more and more as the miles rolled past beneath the horse's hooves. On the 4th day, they reached the outskirts of San Antonio. The city sprawled across the landscape, bigger and busier than Del Rio by an order of magnitude. Buildings rose 2 and 3 stories high. Streets teemed with wagons and horses and people. The noise after days of quiet was almost overwhelming. Gideon guided them to a small church on the edge of town, a whitewashed adobe building with a wooden cross above the door. He helped Penelope down from the horse and steadied her as she swayed on legs gone stiff from riding. "Wait here," he said. "I'm going to find Father Miguel and see if he can give us a place to stay while I track down Carlos." He was gone only a few minutes before returning with a small, round priest whose face was creased with smile lines. "Mrs. Edwards," the priest said warmly, "Gideon has told me of your troubles. You are welcome to stay in the church rectory as long as you need. Come, come, you must be exhausted." Father Miguel's kindness was balm to Penelope's battered spirit. He showed her to a small but clean room with a real bed and even a washstand with a basin and pitcher of water. Penelope could have wept with gratitude. "Rest now," the priest said gently. "I will bring you food and water. Gideon, you come with me. We will find Carlos and see what can be done." Alone for the first time in days, Penelope sank onto the bed and let the tears come. Tears of relief and exhaustion and fear and a dozen other emotions she could not name. She cried until she was empty, then washed her face and hands and lay down on top of the blankets. She woke to darkness and the sound of low voices outside her door. Gideon and another man, speaking in Spanish too rapid for her limited understanding to follow. The other voice was deeper than Gideon's, accented differently. A soft knock came at her door. "Penelope, are you awake? There's someone I want you to meet." She rose and opened the door to find Gideon standing there with a tall Mexican man dressed in the distinctive uniform of a Texas Ranger. He was perhaps 30, with a face that was both hard and kind, and eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Edwards," the man said, removing his hat. "I am Carlos Mendoza. Gideon has told me what has been happening in Del Rio. I would very much like to hear your account of events, if you are feeling strong enough." They sat in Father Miguel's small kitchen, and Penelope told her story from the beginning. She held nothing back, detailing the intimidation campaign the Morrisons had waged, Thomas's murder, the sheriff's corruption, and the attempt to force her off her land. Carlos listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes in a small leather-bound book. When she finished, he sat back and studied her with those perceptive eyes. "You are very brave, Senora. What you describe is a pattern I have seen before, in towns where one powerful family holds too much influence. These situations are difficult to resolve because the corruption goes deep and the fear runs deeper. Can you help us?" Penelope asked. "Can you investigate what happened to my husband?" "I can and I will," Carlos said firmly. "I will need to go to Del Rio and conduct interviews, examine evidence, speak with witnesses. It will not be easy, and I cannot promise that justice will be swift. But I promise you this, I will do everything in my power to bring the truth to light and hold those responsible accountable for their actions." "Thank you," Penelope whispered. "Thank you so much." Carlos stood. "In the meantime, you will stay here under Father Miguel's protection. No one will bother you in this place. Gideon, I would like you to come with me to Del Rio. Your testimony about what you observed and learned will be valuable." Gideon looked torn, his gaze going to Penelope. "I don't want to leave her alone." "She won't be alone," Carlos said. "She will be safe here, and we need to move quickly before evidence disappears or witnesses are intimidated into silence." "He's right," Penelope said, though the thought of Gideon leaving made her chest tighten with anxiety. "You should go. Help him find the proof we need." "I'll come back," Gideon said, holding her gaze. "I promise, Penelope. I'll come back." They left before dawn the next morning, and suddenly Penelope was truly alone for the first time since Gideon had ridden into her life. The days that followed were strange and liminal. Father Miguel was kind, bringing her meals and checking on her welfare, but he was a busy man with a parish to tend and could not spend much time with her. Penelope helped out where she could, mending vestments and altar cloths, sweeping the church floor, anything to keep her hands and mind occupied. But at night, lying in her small borrowed room, she found herself thinking about Gideon constantly, wondering if he was safe, wondering if Carlos would find the evidence they needed, wondering if Gideon would truly come back or if he had seized the chance to be free of the burden she represented. A week passed, then 2. Penelope's belly grew heavier, the baby's movements stronger and more frequent. She began to worry that the child would come before Gideon returned and she would be alone for the birth. But on the 15th day after his departure, as the sun was setting in a glory of orange and purple, Penelope heard hoofbeats in the courtyard. She rushed to the window and saw Gideon swinging down from his horse, his clothes dusty and his face weary, but his eyes bright. She met him at the door of the rectory, and for a moment they just stood there looking at each other. Then Gideon smiled, slow and warm, and said, "I told you I'd come back." "You did," Penelope said, her voice unsteady. "Did you find what you were looking for?" "And then some," Gideon said. "Carlos is a wonder. He's got statements from 3 witnesses who saw Kurt Morrison riding onto your property the day Thomas died. He's got the testimony of a ranch hand who overheard Kurt bragging about teaching your husband a lesson. And he found the murder weapon, Kurt's rifle, hidden in the Morrison barn, with Thomas's blood still on the stock." Penelope's knees went weak, and Gideon caught her, guiding her to a bench. "It's over?" she asked. "It's really over?" "Kurt Morrison is under arrest and charged with murder," Gideon said. His father tried to interfere, but Carlos had backup from 2 other rangers. And even old man Morrison isn't stupid enough to go up against the rangers. Sheriff Coleman is also facing charges for obstruction of justice and accepting bribes. The territorial judge has been suspended pending an investigation into his dealings. He took both her hands in his. "You can go home, Penelope. Your land is yours again." The tears came then, hot and fast and unstoppable. Gideon pulled her into his arms, and she clung to him, sobbing into his shoulder, while he murmured soothing nonsense and stroked her hair. "It's all right," he said. "You're safe now. Everything's going to be all right." When the storm of emotion finally passed, Penelope pulled back, embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I've gotten your shirt all wet." "I don't care about my shirt," Gideon said, wiping tears from her cheeks with gentle thumbs. "I care about you." The way he said it, the look in his eyes, made Penelope's breath catch. There was something raw and honest in his expression, something that made her heart pound. "Gideon," she started, but did not know how to finish. "I know," he said quietly. "I know it's too soon. I know you're still grieving Thomas, and you've got the baby coming, and the timing is all wrong. But I need you to know, Penelope, these past weeks with you have been the most important of my life. You've made me want to be better, to do better. You've made me believe I could be the kind of man worthy of a woman like you." "You already are that man," Penelope said, her voice fierce. "You saved me. You protected me when no one else would. You kept your promises when you had every reason to just walk away." "I could never walk away from you," Gideon said. "Not now, not ever, if you'll let me stay." Penelope knew she should tell him it was too soon, that she needed time to grieve properly, to sort out her feelings. But sitting there with his hands warm around hers, his eyes full of hope and fear and something deeper, she could not make herself say the words that would send him away. "I want you to stay," she whispered. "I know it's wrong. I know people will talk, but I don't care. I need you, Gideon. I need your strength and your kindness and your presence. I don't want to do this alone anymore." "You won't be alone," Gideon promised. "Not ever again." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away, and kissed her with a tenderness that stole her breath. It was nothing like kissing Thomas had been. This was fire and sweetness and a sense of rightness that made her whole body sing. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Gideon rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said. "I know it's fast. I know you might not feel the same way yet, but I needed to say it. I love you, Penelope Edwards." "I love you too," Penelope said, and realized it was true. She loved this man who had come into her life like an answer to a prayer, who had fought for her and protected her and treated her like she was something precious. "I don't know when it happened, somewhere between Del Rio and here, but I fell in love with you." They stayed in San Antonio for another month, waiting for the baby to come. Gideon found work at a stable to earn money, and Penelope helped Father Miguel with the church, feeling peaceful for the first time in months. Carlos Mendoza came to visit several times, updating them on the progress of the trial. Kurt Morrison had confessed to killing Thomas in a fit of rage after Thomas had insulted him again, and was sentenced to hang. His father's empire was crumbling as investigations revealed years of fraud and intimidation. Sheriff Coleman had fled Del Rio and was last seen heading for the Mexican border. A new sheriff had been appointed, a man Carlos vouched for personally. "Your land is waiting for you," Carlos told Penelope, "whenever you are ready to return." The baby came on a cool October night, arriving fast and furious after only 6 hours of labor. Penelope gripped Gideon's hand through every contraction, and he stayed with her despite the midwife's protests that it was not proper for a man to attend a birth. "I'm not leaving her," Gideon had said flatly, and that was the end of that discussion. When the baby finally arrived, red-faced and squalling, the midwife announced, "It's a boy, a fine, healthy boy." Penelope held her son for the first time and felt a love so fierce it nearly stopped her heart. He had Thomas's nose and her chin and a surprising amount of dark hair. She counted his fingers and toes, marveling at the perfection of him. "What will you name him?" Gideon asked, looking down at the baby with wonder in his eyes. "Thomas," Penelope said without hesitation. "Thomas Gideon Edwards." She looked up at Gideon. "If that's all right with you, I want him to carry both their names, the father who gave him life and the man who saved both our lives." Gideon's eyes went suspiciously bright, and he nodded, unable to speak. They returned to Del Rio when little Thomas was 3 weeks old, riding in a borrowed wagon with Father Miguel driving and Gideon riding alongside. The town looked different somehow, less threatening now that the Morrisons' power had been broken and Coleman was gone. The cabin was as they had left it, dusty but intact. Neighbors who had been too frightened to help before came by with food and firewood, offering apologies and congratulations. Penelope accepted both with grace, understanding that fear made people do things they were not proud of. Gideon stayed, of course. He bunked in the barn at first, trying to maintain some semblance of propriety, but it fooled no one. Everyone in Del Rio knew the story of how he had protected the pregnant widow and helped bring justice for her murdered husband. Instead of scandal, there was approval. 3 months after their return, on a bright January morning in 1882, Penelope and Gideon were married in a simple ceremony at the church in Del Rio. Baby Thomas gurgled and cooed through the whole thing, held by a beaming Father Miguel, who had made the trip specially to perform the ceremony. Penelope wore a new dress she had sewn herself, pale blue calico with white lace at the collar and cuffs. Gideon wore a new shirt and had gotten a proper haircut and shave. He looked nervous as Carlos Mendoza, standing up as his best man, gave him an encouraging slap on the shoulder. When it came time for the vows, Gideon's voice was steady and sure. "I promise to love you and protect you and stand by your side no matter what comes. I promise to be the best father I can be to Thomas and any other children we might have. I promise to be worthy of the gift of your love." Penelope felt tears slide down her cheeks as she made her own vows. "I promise to love you and trust you and build a life with you. I promise to be your partner in all things. I promise to remind you every day that you are worthy, that you are good, that you are everything I could ever want." When Father Miguel pronounced them husband and wife, Gideon kissed her with a joy that made everyone in the little church cheer. Baby Thomas added his own squeal of approval, and the sound of laughter filled the air. The years that followed were good ones. Gideon proved to be everything Penelope had known he would be: a loving husband, a devoted father to Thomas, and eventually to the 3 more children they had together. 2 girls, Grace and Hope, and another boy they named Samuel. Gideon never touched a gun in anger again, though he kept his skills sharp and taught all his children to shoot and ride and take care of themselves. He built up the ranch slowly and carefully, always dealing fairly with his neighbors, always standing up for what was right. Penelope sewed and kept the house and raised their children with the same fierce love and determination she had shown in the face of the Morrisons' intimidation. She never forgot Thomas, keeping his memory alive for their son, but her heart belonged fully to Gideon. On their 10th anniversary, as they sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard, Gideon took Penelope's hand and said, "I've been thinking about that day I rode up to your cabin, the day Coleman and his men were trying to run you off your land." "I think about it too," Penelope said. "It was the day everything changed." "I wonder sometimes what would have happened if I had arrived a day later," Gideon mused, "or if I had decided not to come at all." "But you did come," Penelope said, squeezing his hand. "You came, and you stayed, and you loved me when I needed it most. That's what matters." "I came for Thomas," Gideon said, "to pay a debt and honor a friend. But I stayed for you. I loved you before I even knew I was falling. You were so strong, so brave, even when you were terrified. You faced down armed men and an unjust system, and you never stopped fighting. How could I not love you? We saved each other. Penelope said softly. You gave me the strength to keep going when I wanted to give up. I gave you a reason to believe you were worthy of love and happiness. We were both broken, and we healed each other. Young Thomas, now a sturdy 10-year-old who looked more like his namesake every day, ran up to the porch. Pa, can we go fishing at the creek before supper? Sure, son, Gideon said, ruffling the boy's dark hair. Go get your sisters and brother, and tell them to fetch the poles. As the children raced off, whooping with excitement, Penelope leaned her head on Gideon's shoulder. Thank you, she said. For what? For keeping your promise, for coming back, for loving me and my son and building this beautiful life with me. Thank you for giving me a chance, Gideon replied, for seeing past my mistakes to who I wanted to be, for loving me despite everything. Not despite, Penelope corrected. Because of, all of it, the good and the bad, made you who you are, and who you are is exactly who I need. They sat in comfortable silence as the Texas sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. The past, with its pain and loss and struggles, was behind them. The future stretched ahead, full of promise and possibility. And the present, this perfect moment with their children's laughter ringing in the air and their hands intertwined, was everything either of them had ever wanted. In Del Rio, the story of the pregnant widow and the cowboy who declared she was under his protection became the stuff of legend, told and retold around fires and dinner tables. Some versions embellished the details, adding gunfights and dramatic rescues that never quite happened that way. But the heart of the story remained true. A woman in desperate need, a man who stepped up to help, and a love that grew from the ashes of tragedy into something strong and enduring. Years later, when Gideon was in his 50s and Penelope was beginning to go gray, young people would come to them asking if the stories were true. Had she really faced down the sheriff's men while pregnant? Had he really said those words, claiming her protection? It's true, Gideon would say, pulling Penelope close. Every word. I rode up to find armed men threatening the woman my friend had loved, and I could not stand by and let injustice happen. So I told them she was under my protection, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. And I believed him, Penelope would add. Even though I barely knew him, I believed he would keep me safe, and he did. He kept me safe, and he gave me a life I never dreamed possible. Their children grew and had children of their own, spreading the Xander name across Texas. Young Thomas became a lawyer, using his sharp mind to fight for justice the way his stepfather had fought with courage and his birth father had fought with integrity. Grace married a doctor and opened a school for girls in San Antonio. Hope became a rancher in her own right, running cattle across 1,000 acres. Samuel followed in Gideon's footsteps, becoming a man known for his fairness and his willingness to stand up for those who could not stand up for themselves. Gideon and Penelope lived to see their grandchildren born, to bounce babies on their knees and tell stories of the old days when Texas was still wild, and justice was often a matter of personal courage rather than written law. They aged together with grace, their love deepening rather than fading with the passing years. When Gideon's hair turned silver and his hands grew stiff with age, Penelope would massage them gently in the evenings, her own hands spotted and wrinkled, but still tender. When Penelope's back ached from old injuries and the strain of bearing 4 children, Gideon would rub liniment into her muscles and tell her she was still the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. On a warm spring evening in 1912, as the world was changing around them with automobiles and electric lights and talk of distant wars, Gideon and Penelope sat together on the same porch where they had watched their children grow. They were in their 60s now, old by frontier standards, but still vital, still present for each other. Do you ever regret it? Penelope asked. Tying yourself to a pregnant widow with no prospects and a lot of trouble? Not for 1 second, Gideon said firmly. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, Penelope. You and those babies and this life we built together. I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. Even the scary parts, the running and the uncertainty and the danger, especially those parts, Gideon said. They showed me who I really was, not the angry kid who made stupid choices, not the convict trying to outrun his past, but a man who could stand up and be counted when it mattered. You gave me that gift, Penelope. You let me be the man I always wanted to be. You gave yourself that gift, Penelope said. I just provided the opportunity. You're the one who chose to step up, to stay, to fight for what was right. All I did was let you. You did more than that, Gideon said. You loved me, you trusted me, you built a life with me. That's everything. Penelope, that's the whole world. As the stars came out one by one in the vast Texas sky, Gideon and Penelope sat hand in hand, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived. The ranch was prosperous now, with sturdy buildings and healthy stock. The house had been expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family, adding rooms and a second story. The land that had been at the center of so much pain and struggle had become a symbol of perseverance and justice. Inside, their daughter Hope was making supper, her own children helping with the cooking and chattering about school and friends and all the small dramas of young lives. The kitchen glowed with warm lamplight, and the smell of fresh bread and roasting chicken drifted out on the evening breeze. I used to dream about this, Penelope said softly. When I was young and my parents were still alive, I'd imagine having a big family in a home full of love and laughter. Then when they died, I thought that dream was gone forever. Thomas gave me back hope for a future, but you, Gideon, you made the dream real. You gave me more than I ever imagined possible. We gave each other that, Gideon said. That's what love is, I think, not just feeling something for another person, but creating something together that's bigger than either of you alone. We created this. He gestured at the ranch, the house, the land stretching away into the gathering darkness. And more importantly, we created a family that knows how to love and fight and stand up for what's right. That's a legacy worth having. Thomas would be proud, Penelope said, of his son, of what we built here, of how we honored his memory by living well and raising good people. He would be, Gideon agreed. And I like to think he'd be glad you found happiness again. He loved you enough to want that for you. They sat in peaceful silence as night settled fully over the ranch. Inside, Hope called that supper was ready, and reluctantly, Gideon helped Penelope to her feet. They walked into the warmth and light together, greeted by the smiles of their family. Later that night, lying in the bed they had shared for 3 decades, Gideon pulled Penelope close and kissed her forehead. I love you, he said, the same words he had said thousands of times over the years, but still meaning them with his whole heart. I love you too, Penelope replied, snuggling into his warmth. Thank you for protecting me all those years ago. Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible to everyone else. Thank you for every day since. Thank you for letting me, Gideon murmured into her hair. Thank you for taking a chance on a broken-down cowboy with more past than future. Thank you for being brave enough to love again when you had every reason to close your heart. They drifted off to sleep, wrapped in each other's arms, and if they dreamed of golden days and laughter-filled nights, of children growing strong and proud, of a love that had started in crisis and grown into something eternal. The story of how they met, of the pregnant widow who faced the sheriff's men and the cowboy who stepped up to protect her, would be told for generations in Del Rio and beyond. It would become a tale of courage and justice, of standing up against corruption, of doing what was right even when it was dangerous. But for Gideon and Penelope, it was simply the story of how they found each other. 2 wounded souls who met at the worst possible time under the worst possible circumstances, and who chose to build something beautiful from the ruins of tragedy. They chose love over fear, courage over surrender, and partnership over loneliness. And in choosing each other, they created a legacy that would endure long after they were gone, a legacy of strength and compassion, of fighting for justice and protecting the vulnerable, of love that transformed and healed and made all things new. In the end, that was all that mattered, not the hardships they had overcome or the enemies they had faced, but the life they had built together and the love that had sustained them through it all. From that desperate day when Gideon had declared Penelope under his protection to the peaceful nights of their old age, they had walked through life side by side, partners in every sense of the word. And when their grandchildren asked, as children always do, if they had lived happily ever after, both Gideon and Penelope could answer with absolute certainty. Yes, they had. Against all odds and despite every obstacle, they had found their happily ever after together, and it had been more wonderful than either of them had dared to imagine. The ranch continued to thrive for generations, passed down through the family with the understanding that it represented more than just land and cattle. It represented the courage to stand up for what was right, the strength to protect those who could not protect themselves, and the power of love to transform even the darkest circumstances into something bright and enduring. And somewhere in Texas, in a small cemetery on a hill overlooking the land they loved, two headstones stand side by side. They are simple markers, nothing fancy or elaborate, bearing only names and dates and a single line that says everything that needs to be said. Gideon Xander, beloved husband and father Penelope. Edward Xander, beloved wife and mother, together forever. The words are simple, but they contain a universe of meaning. They speak of a love that conquered fear, of courage that faced down injustice, of two people who found each other when they needed it most, and built something beautiful that would outlast them both. And on quiet evenings, when the wind whispers through the cottonwoods and the stars shine bright over Texas, it is easy to imagine their spirits there still, sitting on that old porch hand in hand, watching over the family they created and the legacy they left behind. Their story had begun with danger and desperation, with a pregnant widow facing armed men and a cowboy stepping forward to say 5 words that would change everything. She's under my protection now, but it had become so much more than that moment of crisis. It had become a lifetime of love and partnership, of shared joys and shared burdens, of building something worthwhile from nothing but courage and determination. And that, in the end, was the real story. Not just of survival or justice or standing up to corruption, but of two people who chose each other over and over again, every single day, until their days ran out and they passed into the realm of memory and legend. The children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who came after them would carry forward the values Gideon and Penelope had lived by. They would remember that strength was not just about physical power, but about moral courage. They would remember that love was not just a feeling, but a choice made daily. They would remember that justice was worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. And they would remember the story of their remarkable ancestors, the pregnant widow who refused to be intimidated, and the cowboy who loved her enough to risk everything to keep her safe. It was a story worth remembering, worth retelling, worth holding up as an example of what humans could be at their very best. In the great sweep of history, Gideon and Penelope Xander were just two ordinary people living ordinary lives in a small corner of Texas. They were not famous or powerful or rich. They left no great monuments or discoveries or works of art. But they left something far more valuable, a family rooted in love and justice, a community made better by their presence, and a story that would inspire others to stand up and be counted when it mattered most. And really, what more could anyone hope for than that? To be loved, to love in return, to raise good children and leave the world a little better than you found it, to face darkness with courage and emerge into light hand in hand with the person you chose to walk beside. That was the true happily ever after, not a fairy tale ending, but a real, earned, hard-won happiness built on sacrifice and courage, an unwavering commitment to each other and to doing what was right. The sun continued to rise and set over the ranch in Del Rio. Seasons turned, years passed, and new generations were born and grew and had children of their own. But the foundation laid by Gideon and Penelope remained solid, a testament to what two people could accomplish when they refused to give up on each other or on the values they held dear. Their love story had started with 5 words spoken in defiance of injustice. She's under my protection now. But it had grown into something infinitely larger and more beautiful, a lifetime partnership, a family legacy, and a reminder that even in the darkest moments, courage and compassion could light the way forward. And so, their story ends not with tragedy or loss, but with the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived and love well expressed. They had faced the worst that life could throw at them, and come through stronger and more united. They had built something lasting from the ashes of disaster. They had loved each other truly and completely until their last breaths. That was their victory. That was their triumph. That was their happily ever after, earned through courage and sealed with love that would echo through the generations long after they were gone.